What if everything you thought you knew about American history was incomplete? What if the story you were taught in school only told part of the truth, leaving out the voices, struggles, and achievements of millions of people? Today, we are going to explore a side of history that has been hidden, reshaped, and sometimes even erased: the story of Black Americans and the legacy of the Confederacy. History is more than just dates and names. It is the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a nation. But the version many of us grew up with is not the full picture. It has been carefully rewritten, often to make certain groups look more honorable, and others less so. This is not just about the past, it affects the present, shaping how we understand race, freedom, and justice in America today. Imagine a narrative so powerful that it could influence generations, shaping textbooks, public monuments, and even films. That narrative is known as the Lost Cause. It reimagined the Confederacy as heroic defenders of states' rights, rather than a society built on the forced labor of enslaved people. Leaders were glorified, battles were romanticized, and the true experiences of Black Americans were minimized or erased entirely. But history is not just written in books, it lives in our schools, in our towns, and in the media we consume. Every statue, every carefully chosen story, every historical film contributed to this reshaping of memory. And while some of these narratives may have seemed harmless at first, they had the power to influence attitudes, policy, and understanding for decades. Yet, the truth has always existed, waiting to be uncovered. The courage, resilience, and contributions of Black Americans are profound and undeniable, from the remarkable achievements during Reconstruction to the ongoing fight for equality and justice. These stories provide the full, unfiltered picture of America's past. By learning and acknowledging these truths, we gain a richer, more accurate understanding of history and a clearer view of the path forward. In this video, we will journey through the ways history was rewritten, the consequences of those changes, and the inspiring stories that push back against distortion. Together, we will uncover the hidden layers of the past and understand how they continue to shape our present. If you are ready to challenge what you thought you knew and see history through a new lens, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you do not miss any of our deep dives into untold stories of the past. Trust me, you will want to stay until the very end. Let us get started. In the turbulent years following the Civil War, a man named Edward Pollard stepped into the spotlight with a mission that would quietly reshape the way Americans remembered a conflict that had torn the nation apart. As editor of the Richmond Examiner, Pollard was acutely aware of the fragile state of Southern society. Cities lay in ruins, the economy had collapsed, and families mourned the loss of sons, fathers, and brothers whose lives had been claimed by the battlefield. Yet amidst this devastation, Pollard saw an opportunity not just to document history, but to rewrite it in a way that would forever alter public perception. In 1866, he published a work that would come to be known as The Lost Cause, a book that did more than chronicle events. It carefully recast the Confederacy as a noble defender of states' rights, painting a portrait of Southern honor while obscuring the harsh realities of the society that had fought to preserve slavery. Pollard understood a truth that resonates even today. Controlling the story of the past is one of the most powerful tools a society can wield. History is not merely a record of events. It is the lens through which future generations interpret identity, morality, and justice. By framing the Confederacy as a group of brave men defending their homeland against overwhelming odds, Pollard created a narrative that was compelling, comforting, and, most importantly for him, strategically selective. The focus shifted from the systemic oppression of enslaved people to the virtues of courage, loyalty, and regional pride. Through vivid storytelling, He transformed military defeats into tales of heroism and moral fortitude, ensuring that the South's legacy would endure long after its armies had disbanded. Central to Pollard's argument was the figure of Robert E. Lee, the general whose tactical brilliance and personal dignity he elevated to near mythical proportions. In Pollard's narrative, Lee was not merely a military leader. He was the embodiment of Christian virtue and gentlemanly honor, a man reluctantly drawn into conflict to protect his beloved Virginia rather than to defend the institution of slavery. This careful characterization allowed readers to admire the man and, by extension, the cause he represented, while leaving the darker truths of the Confederacy conveniently in the shadows. Generals became saints, soldiers became heroes, and a nation's moral compromises were transformed into a story of valor under duress. But the influence of Pollard's work did not remain confined to literary circles. His vision set the stage for a broader cultural movement that reached into schools, churches, newspapers, and eventually the burgeoning world of film, by providing a coherent, emotionally resonant framework for understanding the Confederacy. The Lost Cause offered a blueprint that organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy would later use to shape public memory. Through careful oversight of textbooks and public commemorations, this ideology was instilled in children from a young age, ensuring that the next generation would view the South's actions through the lens Pollard had meticulously crafted. Monuments were erected, ceremonies were staged, and the narrative of noble defense became a common refrain in both the North and South, subtly influencing national attitudes and perceptions. Pollard's framing was more than a historical reinterpretation. It was an exercise in cultural engineering, a way of asserting control over collective memory. By emphasizing states' rights over the realities of slavery, he shifted the moral focus of the Civil War, allowing readers to sympathize with the Confederacy while minimizing the experiences and agency of those who had suffered under its system. In doing, he created a version of history that could be embraced without confronting the full weight of injustice, offering comfort to a nation eager to heal yet unwilling to fully acknowledge its complicity in oppression. This approach proved remarkably effective, seeding a narrative that would persist for generations, influencing everything from academic scholarship to Hollywood films and public commemorations. The story Pollard told was deceptively simple yet profoundly powerful, hinging on the idea that honor and heritage could be preserved even in the face of defeat. By portraying the Confederacy as principled defenders rather than perpetrators of systemic injustice, he invited readers to admire courage, strategy, and loyalty, while subtly instructing them on which truths to overlook. This selective storytelling created a cultural echo that would ripple through the decades, reinforcing racial hierarchies and shaping the national conversation about identity, memory, and morality. As we examine the legacy of Edward Pollard's work today, it becomes clear that The Lost Cause was not merely a book about a war. It was a masterclass in narrative control, demonstrating how storytelling can mold collective consciousness and influence the perception of history itself. The choices Pollard made in emphasizing certain virtues while suppressing uncomfortable truths created a foundation upon which a broader system of cultural memory could be built, one that allowed generations of Americans to embrace a version of the past that was more palatable than accurate. Understanding this legacy is essential, not only for appreciating the complexities of historical interpretation, but also for recognizing the enduring power of narrative in shaping both society and self-perception. Through Pollard's lens, the Confederacy was sanctified, states' rights were exalted, and the difficult truths of slavery were pushed into the margins. This narrative did more than rewrite the past. It influenced how Americans would think about freedom, justice, and identity for over a century, demonstrating that the stories we tell about history are never neutral and always carry profound consequences for the present and future. As Edward Pollard's narrative of The Lost Cause began to take root, it quickly became clear that the real power of his story lay not only in the rewriting of events, but in the creation of larger-than-life figures who could capture the imagination of the public. Among these figures, none loomed larger than Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general whose military skill and personal demeanor were transformed through careful storytelling into something approaching legend. In Pollard's framing, Lee was not merely a strategist or a commander. He became the embodiment of moral virtue, a man whose every decision reflected honor, courage, and a reluctant sense of duty to his homeland rather than any allegiance to the institution of slavery. This carefully constructed image would go on to shape how generations of Americans understood the Confederacy, making the story of the South's defeat not a story of systemic oppression but a tale of valor, sacrifice, and nobility under impossible circumstances. The process of mythologizing Lee was as deliberate as it was effective. Through books, newspaper articles, and later educational materials, writers and historians emphasized Lee's personal integrity, his humility, and his commitment to Christian values, casting him as a figure who stood above the moral ambiguities and harsh realities of the society he served. While Lee had, in reality, dedicated his life to a nation built on the labor of enslaved people, the narrative constructed around him carefully excised that truth, allowing audiences to admire his leadership without confronting the consequences of the cause he defended. This selective portrayal created a powerful lens through which the public could view the Confederacy, one that emphasized human qualities and heroic struggle while obscuring systemic injustice. Lee's myth extended beyond mere text. Monuments were erected in his honor, schools were named after him, and ceremonies celebrated his life, all reinforcing the image of a saintly hero whose actions were guided by principle rather than participation in a deeply flawed system. Through these acts of commemoration, the story of Lee became inseparable from the story of the Confederacy itself, serving as a moral anchor for a narrative that prioritized states' rights, regional pride, and the valor of Confederate soldiers over the realities of slavery and oppression. In essence, Lee became a symbol through which the lost cause could perpetuate itself, allowing the Southern perspective to gain moral legitimacy in the eyes of both regional and national audiences. The impact of this mythologizing was profound, particularly in shaping education and cultural memory. Through the efforts of organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, textbooks and classroom instruction were aligned with this heroic image, ensuring that children grew up learning about Lee as a man of unassailable virtue and the Confederacy as a noble endeavor. By elevating Lee to near saintly status, the narrative created a framework for understanding history that emphasized character and valor while systematically downplaying the moral and social implications of the Confederacy's foundation. This allowed generations of Americans to admire and even emulate these figures without reckoning with the full spectrum of historical truth. A strategy that had long-lasting implications for public understanding and collective memory. Beyond schools, Lee's legend permeated literature, theater, and eventually film, where his portrayal continued to reinforce the romanticized vision of the South. Each retelling, whether in novels or on the silver screen, reinforced the image of Lee as a reluctant warrior, a man whose loyalty to his state was pure and principled, and whose participation in the Confederacy was a matter of duty rather than moral complicity. By focusing attention on his personal virtues, these cultural productions effectively diverted scrutiny from the institution he defended, allowing audiences to celebrate heroism without confronting the consequences of the historical realities underpinning that heroism. What made the myth so resilient was its adaptability. Even as social and political contexts changed, the image of Lee could be invoked to serve different purposes: to justify regional pride, to legitimize segregation, or to frame debates about heritage and identity. Through decades of public commemoration, educational instruction, and cultural representation, Lee's myth became a lens through which many Americans understood the Confederacy itself. masking the systemic injustices at its core. His life story was abstracted into a narrative of personal excellence and moral struggle, one that could be admired in isolation from the cause he represented, effectively shielding the broader historical truth from critical examination. Yet the consequences of myth extended far beyond Lee himself. By creating a figure whose virtue and heroism were unquestionable, the narrative of the lost cause gained emotional and moral weight, providing justification for a broader campaign to reshape history. Monuments, ceremonies, and educational materials became tools for embedding this perspective into the national consciousness, ensuring that the sanitized and valorized vision of the Confederacy persisted long after the war had ended. It was a masterful use of storytelling, demonstrating how the selective framing of individuals could transform collective memory, influence perceptions of justice and morality, and shape public discourse for generations. Ultimately, the mythologizing of Robert E. Lee illustrates the power of narrative in shaping history and public perception. By elevating a single figure to almost legendary status, the architects of the lost cause were able to create a moral and emotional anchor for a story that omitted the realities of slavery and oppression. Lee's legend became more than the story of one man. It became a tool for interpreting an entire era, a lens through which Americans could admire heroism while remaining shielded from the uncomfortable truths of the past. In understanding this process, we gain insight not only into the construction of history, but also into the ways that cultural memory, hero worship, and storytelling can influence how a society understands itself and its past, often in ways that endure far longer than the events themselves. As the narrative of the lost cause gained momentum through the writings of Edward Pollard and the mythologizing of figures like Robert E. Lee, a new force emerged to ensure that this version of history would take root in the minds of future generations. This force came in the form of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, an organization of Southern women who recognized the immense power of education as a tool for shaping society. In the years following the Civil War, they understood that controlling what children learned could determine how an entire generation viewed the past. And they approached this task with remarkable organization and ambition. Their mission was not merely to preserve memory, but to actively construct a narrative in which the Confederacy could be admired, its leaders celebrated, and its moral compasses minimized or ignored entirely. These women meticulously oversaw the content of textbooks, scrutinizing every detail to ensure that the story presented in classrooms aligned with their vision. Books that emphasized the brutality of slavery, the struggles of enslaved people, or the achievements of Black Americans during Reconstruction were often removed from schools, replaced by texts that depicted the South in a sympathetic light. Within these pages, Confederate soldiers were portrayed as noble defenders of their homes. Generals were cast as paragons of virtue, and the horrors of the institution of slavery were either downplayed or recast as benevolent guidance. The educational system, which had the potential to illuminate the truth for young minds, was transformed into a vehicle for instilling a particular worldview, one that glorified the Confederacy while marginalizing the voices of those who had suffered under it. The Daughters did not stop at textbooks. They developed curricula, ceremonies, and programs designed to immerse children in this reframed history. Through memorization exercises, call and response catechisms, and school events, students were taught to internalize the values and perspectives the organization championed. Monuments, plaques, and statues became physical embodiments of these lessons, strategically placed in town squares and near schools to serve as constant reminders of the narrative they were meant to embrace. Children learned to recite the virtues of Confederate leaders and the supposed nobility of their cause, absorbing these messages as natural truths, often without question. What made the United Daughters of the Confederacy particularly effective was their ability to combine social influence with institutional power. Membership grew rapidly, extending their reach far beyond the South, and their network allowed them to coordinate efforts to monitor educational content, influence textbook publishers, and organize public commemorations. These efforts created a pervasive cultural environment in which the lost cause narrative was normalized, reinforcing regional identity while subtly shaping national perceptions of the Civil War. By embedding their perspective into both formal education and public memory, the organization ensured that the stories of the Confederacy's valor and righteousness would be passed down as unquestioned historical fact. The impact of this strategic shaping of knowledge was profound. Children educated under this system often carried these beliefs into adulthood, forming a generation that understood history not as a complex interplay of forces, choices, and consequences, but as a moral tale of Southern heroism and victimization. This selective teaching obscured the realities of slavery, Reconstruction, and the struggle for civil rights, leaving gaps in understanding that would influence social attitudes, public policy, and cultural representation for decades to come. What might have been a simple commemoration of the past became an active tool for maintaining social hierarchies, influencing how communities interpreted justice, race, and identity long after the Civil War ended. Moreover, the organization's influence extended into the shaping of public ceremonies and cultural observances, embedding their version of history into the rituals of civic life. Annual commemorations, unveiling of statues, and the celebration of Confederate holidays were all carefully orchestrated to reinforce the ideals they wished to impart. These rituals, combined with the educational initiatives, created an ecosystem in which the lost cause narrative was constantly reinforced, becoming a self-perpetuating system that intertwined memory, education, and identity. Children who participated in these events internalized the lessons not just intellectually but emotionally, linking pride, loyalty, and cultural belonging to the selective truths presented to them. The broader consequences of the United Daughters of the Confederacy's efforts are still visible today. Monuments that dominate town squares, debates over school curricula, and the lingering cultural perception of Confederate figures as symbols of honor rather than defenders of an oppressive system all trace their roots to this carefully orchestrated campaign. By embedding their narrative into the educational and cultural fabric of the nation, they created a legacy in which the interpretation of history was not a neutral recounting of facts, but a moral and cultural construct designed to shape perception, identity, and memory for generations. In examining the work of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, it becomes clear that the power of education is not limited to the transfer of knowledge. It is a mechanism for shaping belief, value, and understanding. Through meticulous control of textbooks, curricula, and public rituals, they crafted a worldview that glorified the Confederacy and minimized the realities of slavery, ensuring that the stories taught to children would influence the collective consciousness of a nation. This deliberate shaping of memory highlights the enduring impact of narrative and pedagogy in constructing the lens through which history is understood, reminding us that the past we inherit is often as much about what has been excluded as what has been included. In the decades following the Civil War, as the lost cause narrative solidified through the work of Edward Pollard and the mythologizing of Confederate figures like Robert E. Lee, another, more insidious process was unfolding behind the scenes. The systematic erasure of Black achievement and political participation during the Reconstruction era from both textbooks and public memory. While schools across the South were teaching children to revere Confederate generals and recite catechisms, glorifying the Confederacy, the remarkable progress made by formerly enslaved people was quietly suppressed, rendering their victories invisible and their voices absent from the official story of America's past. During Reconstruction, Black Americans had seized the unprecedented opportunities afforded by emancipation and the constitutional amendments that followed the war. Establishing schools, newspapers, businesses, and civic organizations, and even gaining representation in state legislatures and Congress. Yet all of this was slowly written out of the narrative that dominated classrooms and public discourse. It is almost staggering to imagine the scale and intentionality of this erasure. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, with their meticulous oversight of textbooks, wielded their influence to ensure that any mention of black achievement, political agency, or civil rights was minimized or eliminated altogether. Figures who had been elected to office, policies that had expanded educational and economic opportunities, and organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau, which had provided vital support to the newly freed population, were either ignored or depicted in ways that reinforced stereotypes and undermined their significance. What might have been celebrated as a period of progress and empowerment became, under the lens of these rewritten histories, a brief interlude of confusion or failure, reinforcing the idea that Black Americans were incapable of self-governance or participation in civic life. This suppression was not accidental. It was deliberate, strategic, and far-reaching. By presenting Reconstruction as a period of chaos and incompetence, textbooks conveyed a subtle yet powerful message. The social and political advances of Black Americans were either unimportant or inherently flawed. In doing, the Lost Cause narrative did more than glorify the Confederacy, it justified the resurgence of white supremacy and the institutionalization of Jim Crow laws, legitimizing segregation and disenfranchisement by implying that Black Americans were unprepared to exercise the rights granted to them under the Constitution. Generations of students grew up believing that the South had been victimized not only during the war, but also during Reconstruction, while the contributions, struggles, and achievements of black citizens were rendered invisible. The impact of this omission was deeply psychological as well as political. By denying young learners access to the full story, these educational practices shaped the collective consciousness in ways that extended far beyond the classroom. Children who absorbed these distorted narratives internalized a skewed understanding of citizenship, justice, and race, often unconsciously perpetuating stereotypes and misconceptions well into adulthood. Communities, meanwhile, built monuments and organized commemorations that celebrated Confederate heroism while disregarding or erasing the institutions and achievements of Black Americans. The physical and cultural landscape became a testament to one side of history. A landscape carefully curated to glorify the Confederacy while erasing the reality of emancipation and Reconstruction. Public memory, too, was meticulously managed to support this narrative. Newspapers, magazines, and public speeches reinforced the notion that black participation in politics and society during Reconstruction was either negligible or disruptive. Academic institutions, influenced by early historians who aligned with the Lost Cause, echoed this perspective, embedding it in scholarship that would define historical discourse for decades. The message was clear. The progress of Black Americans was either irrelevant or threatening, and the historical record should be curated to maintain a sense of Southern virtue and moral clarity. This manipulation of collective memory ensured that even as Reconstruction was a brief moment of hope and empowerment for black citizens, its lessons and accomplishments were denied the recognition they deserved. What makes this erasure particularly insidious is how seamlessly it became part of the national narrative. By the early 20th century, the story of the South as a noble, victimized region, coupled with the minimization of black achievement, had gained acceptance far beyond Southern borders. Textbooks proved by educational boards, reinforced by the authority of prominent historians and civic leaders, taught students across the United States a version of history in which the moral and civic contributions of Black Americans were footnotes at best, effectively silencing voices that had fought for freedom, equality, and representation. Through this omission, Entire generations grew up with a distorted understanding of their nation's past, a misunderstanding that shaped social attitudes, political policies, and cultural values in ways that persist even today. Yet the resilience of Black communities during Reconstruction, despite being erased from mainstream narratives, remains a testament to their courage, ingenuity, and determination. Schools established by formerly enslaved individuals, the newspapers they published, the businesses they founded, and the political offices they won represent a period of remarkable achievement that, even when ignored by textbooks, cannot be erased from the fabric of history. Recognizing this omission is not simply an act of historical correction, it is an acknowledgement of the ongoing struggle to confront and understand the full complexity of America's past. By systematically removing Reconstruction-era Black political participation and civil rights progress from textbooks and public memory, the architects of the Lost Cause effectively rewrote the social and moral landscape of the nation, privileging the narrative of the defeated Confederacy over the lived experiences and accomplishments of formerly enslaved Americans. This selective memory shaped generations, influenced culture, and reinforced racial hierarchies, demonstrating the profound power of education and public narrative in determining what society chooses to remember, and more importantly, what it chooses to forget. In understanding this process, we are reminded that history is never neutral, and that the stories we tell or omit carry enduring consequences for justice, equity, and collective memory. By the early 20th century, the Lost Cause narrative, carefully cultivated in Southern schools, textbooks, and public rituals, had begun to travel far beyond the borders of the South, infiltrating Northern America and the burgeoning entertainment industry in ways that would profoundly shape national consciousness. What began as a regional effort to glorify Confederate leaders and sanitize the history of slavery became, through the mechanisms of popular culture and institutional endorsement, a story embraced on a scale no one could have predicted. In northern cities, where the immediate memory of the Civil War was still vivid but the politics of Reconstruction had faded from public interest, audiences found themselves captivated by tales of Southern nobility, valor, and tragedy, narratives that conveniently omitted the brutal realities of the society these figures had fought to defend. Hollywood, still in its infancy, became the perfect vessel for these stories, translating the selective histories into films that were both visually compelling and emotionally persuasive, ensuring that the Lost Cause reached millions in a form that felt immediate and immersive. One of the earliest and most notorious examples of this cultural adoption was the 1915 film The Birth of a Nation, which, while technically groundbreaking, functioned as a vehicle for Lost Cause ideology, portraying Confederate figures as heroic saviors and Reconstruction-era Black citizens as threats to social order. The imagery, the music, and the dramatization of Southern struggles created a narrative that, for many viewers, felt like truth, embedding a moral and emotional resonance that transcended the factual distortions on screen. The film was screened in theaters across the country, drawing audiences in the North who may have had little direct connection to the South, but were nonetheless profoundly influenced by the depiction of valor, loyalty, and sacrifice framed in the context of the Confederacy. The narrative's power lay in its ability to evoke empathy and admiration for figures whose cause, in reality, had been rooted in the defense of slavery, while simultaneously marginalizing or demonizing those who had fought for equality and Reconstruction. As cinema evolved, the story of the Lost Cause continued to infiltrate mainstream culture. Blockbuster films such as Gone with the Wind romanticized the antebellum South, portraying enslaved people as loyal companions rather than victims of an oppressive system, and depicting the devastation of the Civil War as a loss of regional pride rather than a consequence of human bondage. The sweeping cinematography, melodramatic performances, and richly detailed sets created a world that audiences could lose themselves in, one that reinforced the notion that Confederate soldiers and Southern elites were virtuous and morally upright, while glossing over the very real human suffering that had underpinned their society. Through such films, the Lost Cause narrative transitioned from a regional myth to a component of national identity, subtly shaping perceptions of race, morality, and historical memory for generations of Americans. Hollywood was not the only avenue through which the Lost Cause spread. Northern schools, civic organizations, and public commemorations gradually absorbed elements of the narrative, often under the guise of reconciliation. Monuments erected in Southern towns were celebrated in Northern newspapers, and speeches honoring Confederate figures were widely reported, giving the impression of a shared national admiration for these historical personalities. Even academic institutions in the North were influenced by historians sympathetic to the Lost Cause, embedding its interpretations into curricula and scholarship. This widespread adoption reinforced the idea that the Civil War had been a tragic conflict between noble opponents rather than a struggle over human enslavement and systemic oppression, effectively normalizing a version of history that had been engineered to serve specific social and political agendas. Popular culture beyond film also played a critical role in solidifying the narrative. Literature, stage productions, and later television shows drew on the imagery and themes established by Lost Cause ideology, often portraying Confederate leaders as tragic heroes whose loyalty to their states was the ultimate expression of virtue. These stories frequently highlighted honor, bravery, and familial duty while downplaying or ignoring the realities of enslavement and racial injustice. The emotional appeal of these narratives allowed audiences, particularly those geographically or temporally removed from the Civil War, to empathize with characters who were positioned as moral exemplars, creating a cultural memory that validated the Confederacy's moral standing in the eyes of the public. Even as political power in the North shifted and debates over civil rights emerged, the Lost Cause found ways to remain relevant, its imagery and narratives repurposed to suit contemporary contexts. Civil institutions, museums, and historical societies across the country adopted exhibitions and commemorations that reflected the sanitized version of history, ensuring that the stories told in schools, theaters, and public spaces reinforced each other. This interlocking system of cultural reinforcement meant that Americans, regardless of region, were exposed to a consistent narrative that celebrated Confederate valor, minimized the horrors of slavery, and marginalized the achievements of Black Americans during Reconstruction. The enduring impact of this cultural embrace cannot be overstated. By integrating the Lost Cause into films, literature, and public memory across Northern America, the narrative gained legitimacy beyond its origins, influencing how citizens understood history, morality, and identity. Generations of Americans, many of whom had no personal connection to the Confederacy, internalized these portrayals as authoritative, shaping social attitudes, political discourse, and cultural values in ways that continue to resonate throughout the 20th century and into the present. The North's acceptance of the Lost Cause illustrates how powerful storytelling, amplified through media and institutions, can transcend geography and ideology, creating a collective memory that obscures uncomfortable truths while celebrating selectively chosen virtues. In examining this cultural phenomenon, it becomes clear that the Lost Cause was not merely a Southern project. It was a national one, shaped and reinforced by film, literature, education, and public rituals, reaching audiences far beyond its geographic origin. The embrace of this narrative by Northern America and Hollywood demonstrates the capacity of popular culture and public institutions to legitimize selective interpretations of history, embedding them in the collective imagination in ways that continue to influence perceptions of race, heritage, and morality. It serves as a reminder that the stories societies tell themselves are rarely neutral, and that the intersection of culture, memory, and ideology can powerfully shape the way history is understood, remembered, and transmitted across generations. As the lost cause narrative gained traction through textbooks, monuments, and popular culture, it did not remain merely a social or cultural phenomenon. It became deeply entrenched within the intellectual and political fabric of the nation, gaining powerful advocates who provided it with the legitimacy and authority necessary to endure across generations. Historians, long considered the arbiters of truth and memory, played a central role in shaping this version of history, often aligning their scholarship with the ideological goals of those who sought to sanitize the Confederacy and obscure the realities of slavery. One of the earliest and most influential of these scholars was William Archibald Dunning, whose work at Columbia University gave rise to what became known as the Dunning School of Reconstruction history. Dunning and his disciples portrayed Reconstruction as a catastrophic period in which vengeful Northern politicians imposed corrupt governance on a helpless South, depicting black legislators as incompetent and unworthy of power, and suggesting that the social and political gains achieved by freed people were either illegitimate or inherently flawed. By framing Reconstruction in this manner, these historians provided a veneer of intellectual rigor to the lost cause, transforming a regional myth into a scholarly orthodoxy that permeated academic circles and textbooks alike. Dunning's work, while academically influential, also had profound political ramifications. By casting Black Americans as incapable of exercising civic responsibility and painting Southern white populations as victims of unjust governance, these historians reinforced narratives that justified segregation, disenfranchisement, and the systematic undermining of black rights. Textbooks across the nation began to echo these themes, embedding the Dunning School's interpretations into the education of countless students who would grow up believing that Reconstruction had been a period of misrule and failure, rather than one of possibility, resilience, and achievement. In essence, these historians were shaping not only the understanding of the past, but also the perceptions of contemporary social and political hierarchies, ensuring that the lost cause would influence American identity far beyond the South. The intellectual endorsement of the lost cause was further strengthened when figures within government began to adopt its principles, blending scholarly narratives with the authority of political office. Perhaps the most notable example of this phenomenon was Woodrow Wilson, who, before ascending to the presidency, had established a reputation as a historian sympathetic to Southern perspectives. Wilson's academic work, which portrayed the South as a heroic victim of Northern aggression and characterized Reconstruction as a misguided attempt to impose equality on an unprepared population, dovetailed perfectly with the lost cause ideology. When Wilson assumed the presidency in 1913, he did not leave these views behind in the realm of scholarship. Instead, he brought them into the highest echelons of American governance. Under his administration, federal policies reflected a commitment to the ideals of racial hierarchy endorsed by the lost cause, including the resegregation of federal offices and the purging of black employees who had held positions for decades. Through these actions, Wilson demonstrated the extent to which the intellectual framing of the lost cause could be translated into tangible political power, shaping not only public memory but also the lived experiences of Black Americans across the country. The alignment of scholarly and political forces created a feedback loop that allowed the lost cause to flourish. Historical narratives that glorified Confederate leaders and minimized the horrors of slavery were reinforced by laws and policies that entrenched racial inequality, which in turn validated the interpretations promoted by academics and historians. The interplay between intellectual authority and political implementation ensured that the mythologized South was not merely a nostalgic, cultural artifact but a framework with enduring societal consequences. By lending their credibility to these narratives, historians and political leaders transformed selective memory into institutionalized belief. Affecting schools, public discourse, and civic life. This influence extended beyond the classroom and government offices, seeping into media and public consciousness in ways that further amplified the lost cause. Films, literature, and newspapers frequently cited or drew inspiration from scholarly interpretations that aligned with Southern mythology, embedding these ideas within popular understanding. When audiences consumed these stories, whether on screen, in print, or in civic ritual, they encountered a version of history that had been carefully curated by experts whose authority lent weight to the narrative. This convergence of expertise, governance, and culture created a powerful mechanism by which the lost cause was normalized, transforming what had begun as regional propaganda into a narrative that shaped national identity. Even as the decades progressed, the intellectual and governmental endorsement of the lost cause continued to exert influence. Academic institutions, shaped by early historians sympathetic to Southern ideology, continued to produce scholarship that minimized the significance of slavery and Reconstruction, while political leaders, whether consciously or unconsciously, often maintained policies reflecting the racial hierarchies and selective memories propagated by the narrative. This persistence ensured that successive generations absorbed a history that celebrated Confederate valor, sanitized the horrors of enslavement, and overlooked the remarkable achievements of Black Americans during and after Reconstruction. In examining this intertwining of historical scholarship and political authority, it becomes clear that the durability of the lost cause was not accidental. The intellectual validation provided by historians like Dunning and the practical implementation of its principles by leaders like Wilson created a mutually reinforcing system, one that allowed a regional myth to evolve into a national ideology with profound social, cultural, and political consequences. The lost cause was thus more than a story told to entertain or instruct. It became a tool of governance, shaping policy, influencing public perception, and dictating the contours of memory itself. By recognizing the role that historians and political figures played in reinforcing the lost cause, we gain insight into the mechanisms by which selective narratives can become entrenched, affecting generations and shaping a society's understanding of its past. The interplay of scholarship and power illustrates the profound responsibility borne by those who write history and wield political authority, revealing how interpretation, endorsement, and policy can combine to transform myth into perceived truth, with consequences that echo across time, culture, and the very identity of a nation. As we reach the conclusion of this journey through American history, it becomes impossible to ignore the enduring legacy of the lost cause and the ways in which it continues to shape how we perceive Black history today. Confederate monuments, often erected with great ceremony and fanfare, still dot town squares, courthouses, and public parks across the country. To the casual observer, they may appear as simple tributes to local heritage or as artistic relics of the past. But each statue carries with it a carefully curated story, one that elevates Confederate leaders, romanticizes a war fought to defend slavery, and omits the profound suffering of millions of Black Americans. These monuments are not merely stone and metal. They are enduring symbols of a narrative that sought to normalize inequality and perpetuate the false idea that the South's cause was noble while the struggle for Black freedom and equality was a misstep in the nation's history. Textbooks, too, have played a central role in cementing this selective memory. For decades, generations of students were taught a version of history that minimized or entirely ignored the agency, achievements, and resilience of Black Americans during and after slavery. The stories of Reconstruction-era legislators, educators, and community leaders were left out, while Confederate heroes were celebrated as paragons of virtue. Even today, Debates over curriculum in schools reveal the ongoing tension between presenting a sanitized, comfortable history and confronting the uncomfortable truths of oppression. Systemic racism and the long struggle for civil rights. When young people are denied the full scope of their nation's history, they cannot fully understand the social, economic, and political inequalities that persist, nor can they appreciate the remarkable resilience and contributions of Black Americans throughout the centuries. The impact of this selective history extends beyond classrooms and public spaces. It permeates culture, media, and public consciousness. Films, television shows, and literature continue to revisit, in some cases, romanticize the antebellum South and the Confederacy. Even subtle cues in popular culture, such as the glorification of certain symbols or the omission of key historical realities, reinforce a narrative that was carefully constructed over a century ago. While many Americans consume these stories without question, understanding the historical context behind them is essential to recognizing how propaganda, scholarship, and popular culture combine to shape collective memory. This awareness is not about assigning blame to individuals, but about understanding the mechanisms through which history is told, remembered, and sometimes distorted. Yet, amid this complex web of myths and selective memory, there are also signs of change. Efforts like the 1619 Project, historical scholarship that centers Black voices, and public discussions around monuments and curricula reflect a growing desire to confront the past honestly, by placing the experiences, struggles, and achievements of Black Americans at the center of the narrative. These initiatives challenge the distortions of the lost cause and invite all of us to reconsider what we thought we knew. They remind us that history is not static. It is shaped by those who tell it, and it can be reshaped when we commit to truth, rigor, and inclusivity. The lesson here is profound. Understanding the ways in which history has been manipulated empowers us to become more thoughtful, critical, and engaged citizens. Recognizing the legacy of the lost cause is not about demonizing heritage, but about acknowledging that the stories we inherit influence our perceptions of justice, equality, and morality. When we confront these narratives, we honor those whose voices were silenced and ensure that future generations learn a history that is fuller, richer, and truer. This is not merely an academic exercise. It is a moral imperative, a call to reckon with the past in order to shape a more equitable future. As we reflect on these truths, let us remember that history is a living dialogue, one that demands our attention, curiosity, and critical thinking. Every monument, every textbook, and every story carries the power to shape minds and hearts. By seeking out and amplifying the voices that have been marginalized, we contribute to a more honest and just understanding of our shared past. The story of the lost cause and its influence on American memory is a cautionary tale about the dangers of selective storytelling, but it is also a story of hope, demonstrating that awareness, education, and engagement can transform the way we understand history and, by extension, the society we inhabit. Thank you so much for taking the time to explore this important and often overlooked part of American history with me today. If you found this video insightful, thought-provoking, or even challenging, please give it a like, share it with your friends, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more content that dives deep into the stories behind the history we think we know. By supporting this channel, you help ensure that these conversations continue, that we keep asking the hard questions, and that we keep learning from the past so we can build a more informed and compassionate future. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the pursuit of knowledge and truth is an ongoing journey, and that every step we take toward understanding the full scope of history brings us closer to justice. awareness, and empathy for the generations who came before us and those who will come after. Good night.